Well, good morning. We're going to have a small group this morning because I think there's going to be quite a few people that have been asked to be into a meeting, and that's good that they're doing that. It's unfortunate because what Anthony's going to cover today is really, really good. But it's all, as we've said before, it's all being recorded, so people can catch back up. But let's start with a word of prayer. Father, again, thank you for another beautiful day. Thank you for a day for us to be together, to love on each other, to share your word, Father. And I just pray that you open our hearts, open our minds, and hear what Spirit has to give to us today. It's in Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, so probably my most fun class I've ever taught in my life. I put this question up to get you to think. Why is the world in the situation we're in? And I want you to think more globally than social media or the current administration or the past administration, depending on which way you go. I forgot to ask you for that. Why would you say we're in the current situation we're in globally?
Called the kingdom of darkness.
Kingdom of darkness. Introduced when?
What?
Introduced in when? Okay. Anybody else? Thought process? It's okay. I'll give you my initial answer is the world is in the situation we're in because of the fall brought in by Adam and Eve. That is pretty much where we stand. There's more to it in reading the book of Jude. In Second Temple literature, there are more than just the Adam and Eve event. If you were to go back and ask the people in Jesus' time, why is the world in the situation we're in? Assuming that it is more than just Roman running the country. What is it theologically and spiritually? They would go back, especially the Israelites, would go back and say, well, you have the Adam and Eve event, and then you have the fall of the angels and the sin of the angels, and then you have the Tower of Babel event. And we've talked about the Tower of Babel when we did Romans. So those are the three events that they would say is causing the world to be where we are spiritually. So when we read this, we will get that in Jude. So to kind of unpack where we were last week, Jude, the book of Jude, is written by Jesus' younger brother Jude, and it's written to a group of people that are being influenced by false teachers. That is the reason for the book and who writes the book. And then you get to Jude verse 1, or chapter 1, verse 4. For certain individuals whose condemnation was written about long ago has secretly slipped in among you. These are ungodly people who pervert the grace of God into a license for immorality and deny Jesus Christ, our sovereign and Lord. So we talked about this last week. That these are people that are teaching in the early church that are perverting the grace of God, the freedom that they have. They are perverting that into a license for immorality. And then Jude goes through a series of comparisons where he compares the false teachers that are there. He compares them to, last week we talked about, though you already know all of this, I want to remind you that Jesus at one time delivered his people out of Egypt, but later destroyed those who did not believe. So he starts in on these false teachers, and he compares them to those that did not believe when they came out of Egypt. And then we get to verse 6. And not only are the false teachers like these people that came out of Egypt, verse 6 says, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he, Jesus, has kept those angels in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. And then verse 7, in a similar way, these false teachers, in a similar way to the people that didn't believe when they came out of Egypt, in a similar way to these angels that have sinned, Jude 7, in a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah, since they indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, in a similar way to these angels, are now displayed as an example by suffering the punishment of eternal life. In a similar way, on the strength of their dreams, these ungodly people, these false teachers that Jude's writing about, pollute their own bodies and reject authority and heap abuse on celestial beings or glorious ones. So, Jude chapter 6. Chapter 6. I don't know why I keep saying that. Just habit. Jude verse 6. And the angels who did not stay in their own position of authority but left their proper dwelling, Jesus has kept those angels in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. So, Jude is comparing these false teachers that he's encountering with these angels who have sinned and who have been sent into this pre-purgatory setting. If you read your entire Bible, it will be hard to find this story of the angels who sinned. It's hard to find. It's possibly in there, but the story that Jude is recounting comes from some other place. So, when you read the Bible, right? So when you read this, this is really a series of books and letters that are determined to be in this, really starting in the 300, 400, 500 AD, but really developing later in 1100 to 1500. And it is because at the time, you don't have Paul writing to the Ephesians and going, okay, I'm going to make a book to go in the Bible, so I'm going to write this letter to the Ephesians, and I'm going to put it in a big book that we're going to call the Bible later. That's not why Paul is writing that. When Jude is writing, he's not saying, okay, I'm going to write this letter in hopes that one day I'm going to get in the Bible. That's not the way the Bible was created. When they are there, real time, there is no Bible. There's multiple pieces of literature, multiple pieces of books going around. And so when Jude is writing this, he's writing and quoting a book that we don't see in the Bible. Okay? And one of the books that Jude quotes is the Testament of Moses or the Ascension of Moses. There's some debate as to whether that's two different books or it's one book with two halves. And Jude quotes that later. This book, the book of Enoch, I nearly forgot to show it. This is the book of Enoch. This book is it's not written by Enoch, but it is written probably 200, 300, 400 years before Jesus. It's written to explain what Enoch was doing. Okay? And so when Jude is writing, he is referencing the book of Enoch. And Jude's not the only one. Peter does it. Paul does it. They reference this book of Enoch. Okay? So, specifically the Watchers, the story of the Watchers is the first 36 chapters. It's really, some consider it the first book of Enoch. And the story of the Watchers is what he's describing. So, what do we think historically about Enoch? He's the great-grandfather of Noah. His father is Jared. His son is Methuselah. And he's the seventh one down from Adam. Okay? Now, when you read Hebrews 11:5, by faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found, because God had taken him. That's a direct quote out of Genesis 5. Now, before he was taken, he was commended, or he was testified about, he was witnessed about, as having pleased God. That's a quote out of the book of Enoch. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5, when Jared was 162 years old, he became the father of Enoch. And after he had become the father of Enoch, Jared lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. So Jared lived a total of 962 years, and then he died. When Enoch was 65, he became the father of Methuselah, and after he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked with walked with God 300 years, and had other sons and daughters. So Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked with Elohim, walked with God, and then he was no more, because Elohim had taken him away. And then verses 25 through 33, you have the ancestry of Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. Okay? And then you have Genesis chapter 6. Okay? Genesis chapter 6, verse 1, when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and beautiful daughters were born to them, the sons of God, the sons of Elohim, saw that the daughters of mankind were attractive, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Now, the word wives there also means women. It's the exact same word. Sometimes it's translated wives, sometimes it's translated women. But if you look at it and you translate it women, look how it changes the verse. And they took women, all manner that they chose. Verse 3, then Yahweh said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. Verse 4, the Nephilim, the giants, were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. When the sons of God, the sons of Elohim, came to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them, Yahweh saw the wickedness of mankind was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil. Okay, so let me unpack this for you. So first of all, the word Nephilim, that shows up one other time in Numbers. And the story in Numbers where it shows up is the children of Israel come up to the land of Canaan. They send 12 spies into the land of Canaan. You remember that? 10 were bad and 2 were good. They get over there. They look at the land of Canaan. They come back. And the report they give is the Nephilim are there. And in their eyes, we are like grasshoppers. Okay? Now, when you get the translations on that, sometimes that is translated that they were mighty men. The problem with that translation, in my opinion, is that when you look at the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, when you look at the Septuagint, when you look at the Samaritan Aramaic Bible, when you look at the Jewish Aramaic Bible, they all translate this word as giants. Okay? So you can study on your own and determine what you think giants means, but there was something there that they saw that was big, and I think it was more than, my friend Scott McDowell is 6'11", and he is a big man, and every time I get around him, and his two sons are 7-footers, when I get around them, I'm like, okay, you guys are big. I think there's something more than what they saw as giants. Okay, so let me unpack this verse a little more. Conservative theologians look at this verse and they say the sons of God, the sons of Elohim, are descendants of Seth, and the daughters of man are descendants of Cain. And so this is just another verse that shows that if men and women marry, and godly men and godly women marry ungodly people, then this turns into be the wickedness of mankind. That's what happens when you marry outside the church. That is the conservative viewpoint. They also go further because of the story of Enoch. Enoch unpacks this a little bit different. Okay? Enoch says that the sons of God are angels, and that they descend on the earth and they marry, they take women and they have sex with them and have children. That's what Jude thinks. That's the story of Enoch. The conservative theology says, well, that can't be. That's not a good, viable explanation, because Jesus says that angels don't marry, and so that's not what this means. And the other point here is that before now, angels aren't mentioned in the Bible, and so this can't mean angels. That is the conservative theological position. It's not my position, but it is a position. And it wasn't Jude's position, and it's not Peter's position. They look at the book of Enoch. Now, the book of Enoch reads this way. In the days of Jared, the same Jared, Genesis 5:18, 200 angels under the leadership of Shemaz and Ahazel, filled with lust for the beautiful daughters of men, descended on Mount Hermon and took human women. Now, you got to just tie a thread around Mount Hermon. Okay? If you're reading the Bible historically, tie a thread around Mount Hermon. I'm going to come back to it. And this is in the book of Enoch. Their children, the children of the angels and the daughters of men, their children, the giants, ravaged the earth, and the fallen angels taught men forbidden knowledge of all kinds of sin. So in the first century, you look back and you go, why is there so much sin in the world? Well, you have Adam and Eve, you have the sin of the Watchers, the sin of these angels, and then you have the Tower of Babel. That's why there's sin in the world. And it goes on to explain, they were therefore responsible for the total corruption of the world, on account which God sent the flood. Part of the reason for the flood is because of this angel, human, children teaching of false teaching of all this sin. Okay? The Watchers, the Son of God, were punished by being bound under the earth until the day of judgment, when they will be cast into Gehenna. This is exactly what Jude is talking about. It's exactly what Peter is talking about. When they both write, they are referencing the book of Enoch. Enoch chapter 10, verse 12, God said to Michael, Michael the archangel that we know throughout history, make known to Shemaz and the others who are with him, who fornicated with the women, they will die together with them all their defilement. Bind them for 70 generations underneath the rocks of the ground until the day of their judgment and their consummation, and the eternal judgment is concluded. Their children, the giants, were condemned to destroy each other in battle, but their spirits became the evil spirits responsible for all evil in the world between the flood and the future day of judgment. That's what Enoch talks about, okay? And so then this becomes part of Second Temple literature. As people are reading things and studying, they don't have this to where they go and go, okay, well, this is Malachi, this is in the Bible, so it must be true. They have the book of Malachi, they've got the book of Enoch, they've got the book of Jeremiah, and so they're reading all of these, and when you look at what was discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Dead Sea Scrolls they have certain commentaries on books that were written, helping people to understand what the stories meant, okay? And so when you get the book of Enoch, we don't study the book of Enoch because it's not in our Bible. Well, when we don't study the book of Enoch, we get to Jude and we don't understand what he's talking about when he's talking about the sin of the angels. When he writes the sin of the angels, all of them knew exactly what he was talking about. Okay? So, Jude uses the judgment of the watchers and the angel's vocation as a parallel to the type of false teachers he's writing about. And so when he's looking at the false teachers and what they're doing in the church, he looks back and says, this is exactly what the angels were doing. The angels were teaching falsely all of this error. They were teaching that to the humans. These false teachers that are in the church, they're doing the exact same thing. And so the readers of Jude would get that and they would see that parallel automatically. We don't see it that way. The sin of watchers, there's a direct relationship between the sons of God choosing to leave heaven, to leave their vocation as watchers, as overseers assigned by Yahweh, to leave whatever their job is, and then what they teach is this corrupted version of Yahweh, that you don't believe in God and that you use God's freedom into this license for immorality. So I can go do whatever I want to because Paul said we're free in Christ. And so they're taking that teaching and corrupting it and then teaching it to the church. And Jude is like, this is wrong. This is so wrong. It's exactly like what the Egyptians were doing when they came out of Egypt. It's the same thing the angels were doing. It's the same thing that was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. It's the same thing in Balaam and Korah. And so he's just pointing all that out and tying the thread around it. Are you with me? Okay. So.
And the only other time we get something about these fallen angels is they're in Revelation 12 too, where the great war. And so, without the book of Enoch, I'm saying, we've always known that there was a big battle and Satan took a third of the angels out of heaven and they're fighting. So we know there's a spiritual battle with fallen angels and then God and then angels that came through. That's kind of all we knew. The timing of it, we don't really know. And so I was, our not understanding of some of the writings would have been helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm going to come back to that. And this is the reason why Jude thinks it's a great analogy. Because he's explaining this is how bad things are. And if you follow these false teachers, you're doing the exact same thing that they did earlier. So Jude chapter 6. Why do you keep saying 6? Verse 6. And the angels who did not stay within their own principality. And what he's talking about here is he's saying that they did not stay with within the rule that God had given them. And so he's pointing a parallel between that God gave these angels this certain rule, just like God gave these teachers this rule. And then he goes on to say they left their proper dwelling, their home and their authority, and they rejected the authority, has something to do with this desire for autonomy from God. I don't need God, I can do it on my own. And that's what the angels said. We don't need God, we're going to go do this on our own. And so then he points that out about the false teachers. The false teachers are not doing what God calls them to do. They're doing it on their own. Okay? Now, then he goes on to verse 8. Yet in like manner, these people, the false teachers, are relying on their dreams and defile the flesh, reject authority, and then blaspheme the glorious ones, blaspheme the angelic beings. Okay? And we'll come back to that piece of the puzzle, and we'll come back to verse 7 in a couple of weeks. So then I want you to go and look at what 2 Peter chapter 2 says. Okay? So 2 Peter has the same issue going on about false teachers. And so what 2 Peter, he says, but there were also false prophets among the people, just as there were false teachers among you. They will be secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the sovereign Lord who brought them, bringing swift destruction on themselves. Many of them will follow their depraved conduct and will bring the way of truth into disrepute. In their greed, these teachers will exploit you with fabricated stories. I'm not doing that. I'm just telling you what they're saying. I didn't create these stories. These stories were already created. Their condemnation has long been hanging over them, and their destruction has not been sleeping. For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but sent them to heaven, putting them in chains of darkness. What?
Sent them to where?
Sent them to hell.
Oh, you said heaven.
Oh, did I? Oh, I'm sorry. Sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. So 2 Peter, he's using the exact same story that Jude is using, the sin of the angels, that everybody at the time knew. Okay? So, I want you to look at one other one. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Now, most of us know 1 Corinthians chapter 11, but we're not paying attention to it a lot of times. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for it is just as if her head were shaved. If a woman does not cover her head, she should have her hair cut off. A man ought to cover his head, since he is the image of the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but for woman for man. Here you go. For this reason, a woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head because of the angels. And so Paul also knows the story of Enoch. And he's like, look, when we're in church, there's certain things that have to happen. And part of the reason is because of this angels. To which all of the church in Corinth would have gone, oh yeah, we know what you're talking about. To us, when we read that, we're like, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. Okay? Now you do. Okay, so 1 Peter chapter 3. So if you remember, there is a story where Peter, James, and John go with Jesus, and they go to Caesarea Philippi, right? And they get there, and Jesus is like, hey, who do people say I am? And then James John answered incorrectly. Peter says what? Oh, well, you're the Christ. You're the Son of the living God. To which Jesus turns to Peter and says, on this rock, I'm going to build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail. Right? You remember that story? When you read 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he went to proclaim to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought to safely through water. So, Peter is there when Jesus makes this comment. Peter knows the story of Enoch and the Watchers. He knows the story that this took place prior to the flood. Okay? And if you remember when I said Mount Hermon is where they came down, right? This isn't, last week we talked about Mount Sinai, where God came down and gave Moses the 10 Commandments, right? We're talking about Mount Hermon, which is just outside of Caesarea Philippi. And Caesarea Philippi is right up against the base of Mount Hermon, where at their time they thought there is a lot of bad things that go on at Mount Hermon. This is where the angels came down and took women, right? This is where it all started. And so what Peter says in this verse is, okay, let me tell you something. When Jesus dies, there's something that happens in the 3 days before he is risen. He goes and he testifies to the spirits in prison. The spirits that are in prison that he's talking about are the angels that have been sent to hell, waiting on eternal judgment for what they did prior to the flood. The significance of where Jesus tells Peter, James, and John about, on this rock I'm going to build my church, is he's sitting looking at Mount Hermon, saying, this is where all the spiritual depravity came in. This is where all the evil came into the world. I'm going to build my church right here. I'm drawing a line in the sand, and this is where the church is going to be built. And so then he uses that phrase, the gates of hell will not prevail. And I'm going to tell you, I've heard that story that hell is trying to get into the church. But that's not the way Jesus says it. He says the gates of hell are not going to prevail when the church comes to take over. The gates of hell are around Mount Hermon. And I'm going to build my church right here. And when the church gets built, we're going to take over spiritually. We're going to take over all of this stuff that was brought in the spiritual warfare. And so sometimes we look at our world physically. And I think what Peter is saying, what Paul is saying is, there is a much larger spiritual battle going on. And when Jesus comes, he says, this whole worldly thing and you can't see and you're lame, that's nothing compared to the spiritual war that's going on. And my church is going to win the spiritual war based on what I'm doing. And so when Peter looks at this, Peter says, I know where Jesus was. He went to testify to the spirits in prison, who the spirits in prison look and they see, oh, Jesus has been crucified, Jesus is dead, we're going to win, let's pack our bags because we're going. Jesus comes to testify and say, oh, guess what? You think I've died physically, so you've won and I've lost? That's not the case. I'm telling you, you have lost and I have won because I've defeated death. And I'm building my church up there that will now be the paramount of a spiritual battle that you think you've won, I've won. And guess what? You get to stay here until the final day of judgment when we throw you in hell. That's what Peter is talking about in 1 Peter 3. And so when you look at Jude, Jude is saying, look, there is more going on in the church than just these false teachers. There is a spiritual battle going on, and they are bringing this spiritual corruption into the church. And it's going to be just like the angels that sinned and were sent to hell. That's what's going to happen to these false teachers. And if you follow these false teachers, this is exactly what's going to happen to you. You get that? Does that make sense? There's a lot to unpack in one verse. But it's because we don't know all the backstories, right? And so when we say, I got to use this term, when we say Thanksgiving or Christmas or Easter's coming, we know all the backstory that goes with Easter. You don't have to go and explain Easter. You just say Easter's coming, everybody knows. When Jude uses this angels that sinned and are sent to hell, they all know what he's talking about. And when he lays that parallel down with these false teachers, they all get it. Right? Okay. Whoops. I don't know why that keeps doing that. Chime. I'm having a bad day. Jude chapter 6. And the angels who did not... I think it's been a long day already. And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept those angels in eternal chains under the gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. And then he goes into Sodom and Gomorrah. So Curtis is going to preach next week on not Sodom and Gomorrah. In 2 weeks, Curtis is going to fill in for us next week because Jess and I are going to be gone. In 2 weeks, Jess is going to unpack what he's talking about in Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, historically, when you say Sodom and Gomorrah to us, we immediately click to, oh, well, it was homosexuality and this is why homosexuality is wrong, because it's talked about in Sodom and Gomorrah. When Jude writes about Sodom and Gomorrah, there's a lot more to unpack because they had a different thought process around what was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah than what we do. So Jess is going to unpack that in 2 weeks. Hopefully you'll come back. Hopefully I haven't lost you on this whole angels thing. Hopefully that unpacks it a lot more so that now you understand what Jude is talking about and where all this is coming from. You with me? Questions? I lose anybody? You want me to start over? No.
Yeah, I got one
Yeah.
question. They talk
Yeah.
about the seven generations. What are we talking about? He bound the angels for 70 generations.
70 generations.
What are we talking about? Is that until Christ came and then he revamped it or what?
Do you want to unpack that? 70 generations? 70 generations is a term, not like what we would use. It's a span of time, much like when Israel gets put in, when they get hauled off into captivity, and Yahweh tells how long they'll be there, and so they start checking off. Oh, well, this is year 1, this is year 2, this is year 3. What? And then he tells them, yeah, your time is not the same as my time. My time is different. And so 70 generations is a span of time that doesn't mean the same to us of 70 generations, 70 children, right? And so he has a set period of time where there is a theological debate about okay, well, the 70 generations is when Jesus comes. And so then Jesus goes down to them and tells them, hey, you know, you were counting 70 generations and now you think you're out? You're not.
Yeah, so the Bible uses numbers a lot, a whole lot, and they have significant meaning behind them. 7 is often thought of as completeness. How many days did it take to create? 7 days. So that you'll see 7 or in increments of 7 or 70. So a lot of times, and it doesn't always work out exactly mathematically within the text, but it's used as a sign of completeness.
Yeah, and so like what we would say is next year on my birthday I'll be 55. Or next year I'll be 55. Well, what do you mean by next year? Well, do you mean next year on January the 1st when the new year starts? Or on your birthday? Or, well, does that mean at 12:01 on your birthday? What exactly does next year mean? Well, it can mean different things. But the 70 generations is a completion of, you're going to stay there until your punishment is complete. And then when that punishment is complete, then you're going to hell. Okay? And so there is a big debate about, okay, well, we can count 70 generations down to when Jesus comes. Well, not really. It's a lot longer from the time of Noah to Jesus. It's not 70 generations.
In Daniel 9,
Yeah.
Daniel refers to what Jeremiah wrote, the desolations of Jerusalem, which is 70 years. They use
Yeah.
the same thing. Kind of like completion, and then later on in the same chapter, Daniel refers to the 70 weeks.
70 weeks, yeah.
It's a regularly used.
Regularly used. Just like Enoch and Jude, Enoch was the 7th from Noah. But if you go back and actually look at the actual history of it all, sometimes when you look in the text, it doesn't come out exactly right. There have been people that have tried to go back and chronically put everything in exact order in the Bible, and usually after about 10 years and they go completely insane, they just give up because there are so many factors involved, and it depends on which calendar you're referring to, the time of the ancient and all that, so you can go nuts trying to make it actually add up. But if you get the concept of how they're used to have specific meanings, then it
Okay,
makes more sense.
thanks.
It would be much like, how many times do you forgive?
That's what I was
7
gonna
times
say.
7.
Right.
It's a concept, which
Yeah.
is, you can't count it.
Yeah. It's not 409. It's,
You're not gonna sit and write it down, that
Yeah.
I've forgiven this many times until now.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
concept.
it's a completeness. You completely forgive, not a number I'm keeping count. Right? Okay. Anybody else? Good? Appreciate y'all being here. Curtis, you're teaching next week, right? And then in 2 weeks, Jess will be back and we'll do Sodom and Gomorrah.
Thank you.
And then